Module 3. Separation of Powers and Branches of Government. Role of Congress. The legislative branch of the federal government consists of the Senate and the House of Representatives. Together they are referred to as Congress. Congress's power can be divided into lawmaking, budgeting, and oversight powers. The lawmaking process begins with a bill proposing a new law. If both the Senate and the House of Representatives vote to adopt the bill in an identical form, the bill is sent to the President. If the President signs the bill, it becomes a law. However, even if the President decides to block the proposed law by vetoing the bill, Congress can override the President's veto by a 2/3 majority vote in each House, and the bill becomes law over the President's objection. Congress also plays an important role in domestic and foreign policy through its power to set the national budget. Congress funds the federal government through appropriations bills. Under the spending power given to the legislative branch in the Constitution, Congress also sets the federal budget. These powers give Congress strong leverage over the different parts of the executive branch, including governmental departments dependent on Congress for funding. Congress may also limit or threaten to limit funds for military or diplomatic campaigns by the presidents that lack strong support in Congress. In this way, although the President is responsible for directing federal department and agencies, as well as conducting foreign affairs, Congress can use its control over the budget and spending to exert influence over these domains. This leverage that Congress has by virtue of its control over federal funds is called the power of the purse. Finally, Congress plays an oversight role over the other branches of government. Congress may enact reporting requirements which require public bodies to submit reports to Congress regarding the implementation of public policy. Likewise, Congress can conduct investigations through hearings of congressional committees at which government officials can be compelled to testify. Congressional committees also engage in fire alarm oversight, in which the committee investigates evidence of wrongdoing by a government official such as misuse of public funds. Role of the President. The Constitution grants the executive power of the federal government to the President of the United States. This means that the President has the authority to take measures to ensure that laws enacted by the legislative branch are implemented and enforced. The President is also the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. In this role, the President has broad powers to defend and maintain U.S. security. In addition, the Constitution also tasks the President with the responsibility to negotiate with foreign governments, appoint ambassadors, and, subject to Senate approval, make treaties. Each of these three roles, as Chief Executive, Commander-in-Chief, and Diplomat-in-Chief, involves a wide range of complex responsibilities, and they are not carried out by the President alone. A system of executive departments and agencies operate as part of the executive branch. While the delegates to the Constitutional Convention distrusted the type of administrative power wielded by the institution of the British monarchy, they also realized that legislative bodies were not well suited to an administrative role. They operate too slowly and inefficiently to effectively carry out administrative tasks. So under the constitutional system, the President nominates candidates to head the executive departments of the federal government, such as the Department of Justice, the Department of Treasury, and the Department of Defense. But the nominations are subject to Senate approval. These executive department heads run their respective departments on behalf of the President, making the President's oversight and control over the federal government more efficient, and together serve as an advisory council to the President, known as the Cabinet. The President also appoints advisors that work directly for the President. These advisors are not subject to Senate confirmation and have less formal power than Cabinet members, but can assist the President in making and communicating policy decisions and agendas or focusing on specific areas such as national security or economic policy. The President also serves as the U.S. Chief Diplomat. Aside from making treaties and appointing ambassadors, the President is responsible for conducting foreign affairs of the United States. Alexander Hamilton in the Federalist Papers argues that investing one person with executive responsibilities more effectively allows the decision, activity, secrecy, and dispatch of that individual to be exercised to a greater degree than if the responsibilities were shared among a committee of people. This is undoubtedly true in the realm of presidential diplomacy, in which, in addition to secrecy and dispatch, meaning promptness or speed, the unity and continuity of command, along with the necessary access to information, are key ingredients to successful diplomacy. The president has many diplomatic levers at his or her disposal, and may use America's military or economic strength as leverage when dealing with foreign power. Some policy experts, however, encourage presidents to use soft power when engaging with foreign powers, even with foreign adversaries. Soft power attempts to influence the conduct of other countries through non-coercive means, such as cultural openness or cooperations on humanitarian matters. The president's conduct of foreign affairs also depends on the attitude towards involvement in global affairs taken by the president and presidential advisors. Historically, some American presidents have pursued foreign policies that sought to increase U.S. global involvement to strengthen American diplomatic and economic power, while others were careful not to engage deeply outside the Western Hemisphere for fear of being entangled in foreign military actions. As Commander-in-Chief, the President is the head of the chain of military command and exercises supreme authority over the U.S. Armed Forces. However, the Constitution grants Congress the sole power to declare war. Scholars have long debated which powers the President is granted as Commander-in-Chief and, likewise, what authority the President has to order the military to act without a declaration of war from Congress. In 1973, after years of military involvement in the Vietnam War without a declaration of war from Congress and the loss of tens of thousands of U.S. soldiers, Congress attempted to reassert its authority over war-making with the War Powers Resolution. Under this new law, the President could only send U.S. military forces into hostilities or into situations with the imminent threat of hostilities by a declaration of war or statutory authorization by Congress. The only exception is in response to a national emergency created by attack upon the United States. In such circumstances, the President may act without the consent of Congress, but must inform Congress of such action within 48 hours, and must withdraw the troops from hostilities within 60 days if Congress does not declare war or give statutory authorization to continue hostilities. The purpose of the law was to check the President's power to commit U.S. forces without congressional approval. Since its passage, U.S. presidents have asked Congress for authorization for the use of military force on several occasions, consistent with the resolution. At the same time, presidential administrations have maintained that the War Powers Resolution is unconstitutional. The primary argument is that the Constitution's grant of executive power to the presidents include wide-ranging powers over the conduct of foreign affairs, including matters of war and peace. As such, according to this view, Congress's attempt to limit such powers in the War Powers Resolution violates the constitutional separation of powers between the executive and the legislative branches. The role of the Vice President. Next to the President, the highest-ranking office in the executive branch is the Vice President. The only formal role given to the Vice President by the Constitution is to preside over the Senate. The Vice President votes in the Senate only to break a tie. However, it is also the Vice President's constitutional responsibility to assume the office of the President if the President cannot carry out his or her duties. In U.S. history, Vice Presidents have assumed the role of President following the death and resignation of Presidents. This has happened at key moments in history, such as when Harry Truman ascended to the presidency following the death of Franklin Roosevelt as World War II was coming to an end, or Gerald Ford succeeding Richard Nixon following Nixon's resignation in the aftermath of the Watergate scandal. The Judiciary. The judiciary branch consists of the federal courts. The Constitution established the Supreme Court of the United States and granted powers to Congress to establish other federal courts. Congress set up a three-tiered system of federal courts: district courts, which are the trial courts of the federal judiciary, courts of appeals, which hear appeals from the district courts, and the Supreme Court, the highest court of appeal in the United States. The Supreme Court is the court of last resort in the United States. This means that the decisions of the Supreme Court are not subject to review by any other court. Generally, the Supreme Court may only hear cases that have been appealed to it after being adjudicated in the lower federal courts. However, the rulings of the Supreme Court are final and must be followed by all states and all courts in the United States. Federal judges are appointed by the President with the consent of the Senate. Accordingly, the Senate can check the President's capacity to form the judiciary as he or she sees fit. Once a federal judge has been confirmed by the Senate, the judge remains on the court until the judge decides to retire or upon the death of the judge. The only other way to remove a sitting federal judge is through the impeachment process, in which the House of Representatives impeaches the judge for judicial misconduct and the Senate votes to convict and remove the judge by a 2/3 vote. When the Senate is controlled by the party that is not the same party as the president, presidents can face a difficult challenge to get judicial nominees approved. Often, such a divide between the president and the Senate forces compromises over judicial nominees. However, it can also lead the Senate to delay approving the president's choices for judges until a new presidential administration nominates a judge more to the liking of the party controlling the Senate. Because federal judges have lifetime appointments, the determination of who will sit on federal courts is an important way for a president to pursue policy goals. This is especially true of appointments to the Supreme Court as the highest court in the land. Historically, presidents have selected nominees to serve as Supreme Court justices for a mix of reasons, including intellectual acumen and demonstrated legal skill and scholarship, ideological sympathy with the nominee's judicial approach, or a desire to increase representation of diverse groups on the Supreme Court. At the same time, other factors such as party loyalty, geographic diversity, and a determination as to which nominee can gain Senate approval may also play a role. For example, when President Barack Obama nominated then-Judge Sonia Sotomayor to fill a vacancy on the Supreme Court in 2009, he did so for several reasons, including Sotomayor's record of judicial performance, Sotomayor's sympathies with the Democratic Party, and as the first Hispanic woman appointed to the Supreme Court, to increase the diversity of group representative on the court. Congress and the President will often make determinations regarding policy and setting agendas in light of the judicial philosophies of the judges on the federal courts. Judges who favor judicial activism take an expansive view of the court's role in interpreting the Constitution and striking down laws as unconstitutional when the laws conflict with the judge's broad understanding of the Constitution. A judicially activist court may impose caution on the part of lawmakers who may fear that overly ambitious or controversial laws may be overturned by an activist court. Conversely, judicial restraint is a legal philosophy based on narrowly interpreting the text of the Constitution and advocates deferring to the judgment of the legislative and executive branches, the political branches, in the absence of clear evidence of unconstitutionality. This approach may encourage the political branches to pursue bolder agendas without fear of interference from the courts. The bureaucracy. The federal bureaucracy consists of administrative agencies that are part of the executive branch. However, due to their power and relative independence from the President or Congress in their day-to-day operations, the bureaucracy is sometimes called the fourth branch of government. The federal administrative agencies are governmental entities created by Congress to implement certain legislation passed by Congress, which require a highly expert and detail-oriented decision-making body to be put into practice. Congress creates these agencies by passing an enabling law, which specifies the purpose of the agency, provides guidelines to the agency for how they are to function, and delegates authority to the agencies to investigate and to set standards and enforce them. Two important ways which administrative agencies accomplish the purpose set to them by Congress are rulemaking and adjudication. Rulemaking is the process by which federal agencies issue binding rules to implement the mandate of the agency. Agencies also conduct adjudications, which are judicial hearings that issue rulings on matters related to the purview of the agency on a case-by-case basis. Because administrative agencies are responsible for the specific rules and standards applicable to areas such as commerce, agriculture, Social Security, taxes, and the environment, the federal bureaucracy has a more direct impact on the lives of Americans than the President or Congress. However, all three branches have ways to check the bureaucracy and to limit the regulatory power exercised by the agencies. The President appoints the heads of the agencies, subject to Senate approval, and the President may remove them, generally without needing good cause. In this way, the President maintains a degree of control over the direction of the agencies. Congress may also check the federal bureaucracy through congressional oversight. This can include investigating the practices of the agency to ensure they comply with the authority given to them by Congress, such as by summoning the heads of agencies to testify before congressional committees. Congress may also make decisions about budget allocations that impact agencies by limiting the resources the agencies have to carry out policy initiatives. Finally, the judicial branch can examine the operations of administrative agencies in cases brought before the courts to determine if an agency has exceeded its delegation of power from Congress. The courts may overturn agency actions or decisions that are found to be arbitrary or capricious. Policymaking and government spending. Government is a general term for the rules and institutions that result from political action. Since people, groups, and organizations have different interests and values, they try to influence the government to shape society in a way which furthers these interests and values. The primary way governmental institutions are responsive to such expressed interest is through policymaking. Policymaking begins by defining the problems to be addressed through governance. This involves the identification of the issues that should, in the opinion of lawmakers, civil society groups, and political parties, be the subject of new governmental policies. This step is called agenda building. Once an agenda has been settled on, those behind the agenda must formulate a practical approach to solving the issues on the agenda. Following this policy formulation step comes policy evaluation. At this stage, the policies crafted to address the agenda issues are reviewed to ensure that they actually serve to remedy the underlying problems the policies were developed to address. At this stage, the circle of those consulted on the policies may be expanded to include more voices, and alternative ways of addressing the issue may be considered. Once the policies have been reviewed and refined, the next stage is the decision-making stage. Here, lawmakers, or other types of decision-makers in public institutions, decide whether to adopt the proposed policy, postpone the decision in hope of a more favorable political environment, or discard the policy proposal altogether. Even once a policy is adopted, the policy-making process does not end. The policy must be implemented through the organs of government, which can involve executive administrative bodies advising practices for putting the new policies into practice. Finally, parties who are invested in the policy and in related policies in the future will evaluate the results of implementing the policy to determine if the policy worked as expected and assess what lessons can be drawn for ongoing policymaking. Implementing successful public policies can also impact the role of government in policymaking more generally. Political scientists have identified a process called policy feedback cycle, in which the implementation of new policies changes the political environment in a way that encourages further political change. On this understanding, the cycle begins with new policies creating programs that benefit the public. If a policy is implemented successfully, citizens may personally interact with public officials and administrative representatives and see the positive changes such a policy can bring to their lives. In turn, this can lead to increased public engagement and political involvement by citizens, which itself may facilitate the implementation of future successful policy initiatives. Certain economic realities also underlie government policies, especially those related to government spending and taxes. The federal government operates at a debt, which means that the government spends more money on public services and programs and other expenditures than it collects in taxes. This means that the national debt owed by the government and the interest rate on the debt is most likely to rise when Congress lowers taxes but increases spending on federal services. Some economists worry that an increasingly large national debt can have a negative impact on the U.S. economy, including increased inflation. Inflation occurs when the purchasing power of money declines over time, leading the price of goods and services to rise. In practice, this means that a product or service costs more than it did in the past, even if the quality or utility of the product or service remain the same. Politicians will often go to great lengths to avoid inflation for fear of being held responsible for increasing prices, which directly impacts the daily lives of citizens. The New Deal and American Federalism. On October 28, 1929, the U.S. stock market dropped precipitously. This catastrophic market crash, along with other financial crises of time, signaled the end of a decade of economic expansion, leading to what we now call the Great Depression. The Great Depression was the longest and deepest economic downturn in U.S. history. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt became president in March of 1933, the devastating effects of the Depression were ongoing. In response, Roosevelt undertook a series of measures which he referred to as the New Deal. Under the New Deal, legislation spearheaded by Roosevelt and passed by Congress over the course of several years, the federal government established a series of financial reforms, public works projects, and relief programs to combat the widespread poverty and unemployment and bring the Great Depression to an end. The New Deal was not only a means of responding to unprecedented economic disaster. With the scope of activity undertaken by the federal government and the cooperative relationship it envisioned between the federal government and state governments, the New Deal changed existing conceptions of the proper role of the federal government. As a federal system, the U.S. government divides power between the national federal government and state governments. Under this mode of federalism, known as dual federalism, the national government and the state governments each operated as separate sovereign powers responsible for different areas of governance. The desperate need for federal government assistance that arose in the wake of the Great Depression rendered the existing dual federalism obsolete. The New Deal ushered in the age of cooperative federalism, in which the federal government and state governments work together to implement policies to provide aid for those in need and stimulate the economy. For example, a new federal administration created to provide relief for the unemployed worked through federal government providing funds to state governments, which would administer and distribute the funds to those in the state who were out of work. The New Deal also expanded the role of the federal government into areas which had previously been state responsibilities. Federal employment regulation created a nationwide minimum wage and restricted child labor across the nation. The adoption of a Social Security system for providing benefits for the elderly meant that the federal government would provide direct aid to millions of Americans. Together, the New Deal programs shifted power from state governments to the federal government, which became a more centralized source of government benefits and regulation familiar to us today. At the same time, another part of the legacy of the New Deal and the dramatic increase in government spending that came in its wake is the massive national debt the federal government had accumulated in the past several decades.